I'd like to introduce Edward Farrell, the Director of Mercury Information Services. Mercury. And we're going to be exploring some of the wireless environments you can find in all the major cities. Please give it up for Ed.
I think I'm just a little bit shorter there, Will. And there we go, I might go there. Can everyone hear us? Woo! No, well, folks, welcome to AusCERT2023. This is now my 8th year doing a presentation or something a little different. And today I'm talking about, as the title suggests, exploring wireless landscape of an urban littoral. So a bit of an agenda for us. I also like putting a QR code on my slide deck to save you all from taking constant photos. So the slides are freely available. If you walk away from this talk in like 30 seconds because you've got the slides, I'm not going to be too fussed. Yes, trust the QR code the hackers just put up on screen. Totally not malicious. But yeah, look, today we'll be going through a bit of me, a bit of what I've done this, getting a bit of a frame of mind. I think that's probably one of the things that I'll really instantiate in terms of direction. A few thoughts that I've experienced when I've done exploring wireless technologies, and also just some conclusions and some so whats, and also a bit of direction should you wish to go and do some of this yourself. So this is me. I don't always dress like that. But I run a cybersecurity practice called Mercury Information Security Services. We just call ourselves Mercury because no one gets the full name right. I also lecture at the Australian Defence Force Academy in wireless cybersecurity. As for those of you who've come to my talks over the last couple of years, I just like to do weird and wonderful explorations and research and discovery of things. So this talk is focusing on wireless technologies, and as I was starting to write it, as I was starting to conceive it a little bit more, I had to do the why have I done this. And I just kept coming up with points of why that are all on screen. But the TLDR really is I want to let people, well, get people to leave AusCERT or any of the presentations I give over time, leave these talks with either an inspiration or something else to be thinking about. And so if you have a look at the direction I've taken on this one, I've actually focused not on a very specific topic, but I've actually tried to look at very much systems of systems. As I said, most of my work historically has been pen testing. A lot of the networks that we now do our assessments against, focusing on the network itself is no longer really an effective mechanism for doing assurance or doing any security work. And I'll talk a little bit of why that is from an ethos and a mental standpoint from a lot of our blue team appreciation. But if we have a look at it, we've got systems of systems, we've got interconnectivity, and then we've got all these complexities of the environment that's coming out that Killcullen referred to as our urban littoral. Now, when we use this phrase, think about Year 9 geography, how we looked at rural urban migration, for those of you who did Year 9 here in Australia and had that as a subject where, okay, we've now got population centres that are growing. Within that, we also have the fact that since the Industrial Revolution, the idea behind our tools and our mechanisation of our industrial centres has meant that our only capacity to survive has been because of machines which have allowed the growth of those environments. And now we are seeing that in a digital space, but also we consider this from a wireless point, which I'll detail a bit later. This is also a nice Venn diagram I like illustrating as well. When someone asks what's cyber, I usually point to this diagram where I talk about the intersection of these environments. And when we look at our urban environments and our infrastructure, they all kind of factor in these overlaying components, but now we also need to think of things like mass urbanisation, overpopulation of some of our environments, the degradation of the physical environment and how that plays out, failed governance and which are occurring probably not so much in Australia, although I'm so sure some of you might question that. But then we have all this technological dependency and complexity behind that I don't think we fully understand, because when we talk about wireless environments, someone just goes, oh yeah, Wi-Fi, it's just Wi-Fi. You just do Wi-Fi. And then all of these overlapping converging systems that play into it. So at the end of the day, when we start thinking about this, we have a heavy dependency on technologies that allow us to live. We have an air conditioner in this room that I'm sure most of us won't be able to survive with here in southeast Queensland, as a very simple example, but things like our water, our heating, our electricity, our logistics system all start playing in. And then beyond that, I also like to talk about what I call just social cohesion and our interaction, which our technologies facilitate. But this isn't anything new, and continue with the theme of AusCERT. The physical environments and physical infrastructure that we have in our modern urban littorals is consistent with, or a lot of the themes and effects are still consistent with, well, we all keep hearing these analogies of castles. I also like talking about things such as 1850s France, where it was an unplanned overgrown city which created riots, which then led to the introduction of the boulevards in Paris, which were designed to actually facilitate the movement of cavalry to quash rebellion. And so what has happened since that period is cities haven't quite been as well architected with security in mind. And I think for me it's a curiosity as to, all right, how does this now play out in our digital infrastructure? But also the same concepts when we look at wireless technologies, if I can now go from the physical security environments to now our technical environments, a lot of our concepts from wireless technology and wireless security haven't really changed much since 1907. We can still do interception, we can still do impersonation, and we can still do direction finding. If you ever want to find the oldest identification of a vulnerability in a system, Neville Maskelyne pranking Marconi's wireless in London is a good illustration of risks that a vendor didn't think through, but also of well thought out trolling by a classic gentleman. And then over time we saw this evolve into mechanisation of the process. So certainly World War I, it was still very much a crafted industry, but when we looked at wireless communications, by the time we came to 1945, we started seeing information synthesis and starting to orchestrate data coming together. We saw the breaking of, you'd call it encoding, but they call it encryption. We also looked at things like pattern of life analysis as well coming out as well, and even considerations around deception and how that played out on the battle space. And so all of these concepts start to overlap and overlay into our wireless urban littorals. So when it comes to wireless technologies, a lot of us are familiar with the idea of war driving as at its very simplest level. What I want to do is take a few steps back and amplifying this into other environments. But before we even look at that, I think it's important to look at a couple of general considerations when we look at wireless tech. I think probably for me the first thing I started typing out was privacy, and it's a case of, it's just one of these things that we do need to be mindful of when we start doing any sort of exploration. We then also need to start layering in so many variables because it is no longer it's no longer controlled electromagnetic transmissions going across a wire. It's getting broadcast a bit everywhere. So off the back of that, well, are we in one place? Are we static? Are we moving? What's our actual location? Are we interacting with our targets, or are we just listening? At what time is transmission taking place? When do we discover it? How much time do we have to analyse and process some of this information as well? You'll see it in some of the data sets I've collected. We could really go in some deep dives, and every time I look back at it, it's like, oh, there's a lot more here. And then, of course, we need to be thinking about layer one, and in the case of wireless technologies, we now need to looking at radio frequencies and even antenna theory. Things like line of sight, which if you've got a well-built environment is certainly a challenge. Power of not only our own equipment, but also the equipment transmitting that we're trying to detect, and is it within a detectable range? What's happening at that very point in time? And then on top of that, other things, and I'll go through when I start describing some of our hardware, is what's our onboard capacity to start collecting information and processing it, but also does the systems that we have set up for collection, do they move at the speed at the speed we need to, then how does that scale? I also like coming back to Western thinking and mindsets. I alluded to this a little bit before, which is we have a habit, I think probably in network computing disciplines, where we often operate on specific concepts around routing and switching. We operate on the idea of a client-server architecture, and sometimes that can throw us off when we start playing in the wireless space. But also we have a bad habit, and I talk about this from a red teamer's perspective, where blue team will be playing a game of chess where it's, okay, I have to protect the king, that is my focus, that is my concentration of force. Whereas I think if we're operating in more wireless technology spaces, if we're kind of thinking through, well, everything's kind of a bit everywhere, that is probably a better way to think of some of the challenges we have. But then we also have all the protocols as well. We're all fairly familiar with Wi-Fi, but then here's everything else that we're using in our environments. Are we using GPS? Are we using cellular communications? Does infrared play in? Are there specific bespoke radio protocols? Tetra is something I've been playing with a lot. DECT is another thing that we've been looking at with headsets and some of the IoT equipment that we've been testing. And then are there hardware considerations with what we're using? Are there issues within the protocol that we need to be conscious of? So 802.15.4, when I started playing this space, channel hopping was wholly ineffective because some of your systems were only communicating maybe one packet every couple of seconds. You compare that to 802.11, where it's a constant burst. Your capacity to discovery and enumeration is actually quite easy, whereas your ability to identify a network that's only communicating every now and then, which you certainly see in IoT-based systems, starts to become a challenge, and these become some of the fundamentals that you need to think about in some of these protocols. We then also need to be thinking about, well, what are the technologies that exist in our urban environment and how they're getting employed? So going from the protocol, building up into use cases, how is this getting applied? So we have some of our commercial systems, things that we use for our standard IT functions. Building and facilities management is a topic of interest of mine. So when we've done pen testing on BMS-based environments, there's all of these weird and wonderful devices that no one's really quite thought through. But then everyone keeps falling back on, well, it's Wi-Fi, we can't see Wi-Fi. It's like, no, this isn't just a 802.11 network. But then there's also maritime and aviation, which have their own wireless technologies, and think through how they interact. Logistics and transportation will also have some play out here, whether that's tracking systems or something very specific. We then have general communications technologies as well, such as those used for personal infrastructure or entertainment. Security is another interesting one. I was just catching up with Moff at the lockpicking table. If you haven't picked up your lockpicks yet, I would strongly suggest you go do so. But I was just taking through some of the data sets that we collected and identifying some of the security devices that we'd identified. Same with utilities, so your power, your water are also playing a factor there as well. Some of the collection that we have done, we probably haven't seen as many of those as I thought we would have. And then finally, public alert and communication systems, which Balint Sieber did a bit of research on. Just out of a couple of things to note on the photos here. So I've just dropped in a CubeSat, which might also factor in here as well. So skipping over the terrestrial environment and going into space, does that actually start playing out into our environments, and is that still in scope? But also, this is a solar power farm down in Canberra on the bottom photo there. Don't worry, not COVID. A couple of things to look at there. We have an array of solar power panels that are all using 802.15.4. In the center there, if you think of that as your hub, you actually have a point to where all those solar power panels are communicating to. Curiosity I've always had here, and we haven't gone off and tested it, but is there a control function that's occurring over wireless technologies that if we were to manipulate these solar power panels, could we invert them in such a way that, okay, they're no longer collecting solar power, given that's about a 5 to 10% factor in the electricity grid, what does that do to the city of Canberra? So we've already had some fairly well known methods of being able to collect data and identify what our urban environments look like. Wiggle has been around now since 2000, which allows us to, so what happens with Wiggle is individuals will collect data for 802.11 networks and publish it into Wiggle. And this can include individual access points as well as MAC addresses and some security parameters within those networks. We've known about this for ages. I would actually say it's been a massive value add from a security standpoint, because people now start getting aware of, hey, our networks are going to be known. Does this present a possible attack vector for us? Probably a little less known is MapRad, which takes all the data from ACMA and in Australia and allows us to identify licensed transmitters that have been licensed by ACMA. And if you have a look at a city like where I live in Sydney, within the from the centre of the CBD, there's almost 27,000 licensed transmitters within a 5-kilometre radius of the city. This has been fantastic when we've done testing, because we can actually identify transmitters associated with specific companies, and it's a really cool way to map things out. But that's really only the initial point for discovery. And so for me, a lot of my efforts over the last couple of years has been, I've wanted to actually identify as much information as possible and dive even further, because it's only so much to simply say, oh yeah, this is hackable. I think unless there is a body of evidence that you've been able to collect or data that you've been able to draw upon, you can't really make any conclusions on anything. So this is myself and another colleague in industry going out on a bit of a war drive. The ominous glow in the back of the vehicle is not radiation, but what I've done over time is actually start to bring together tons and tons of wireless devices to actually support collection, and I'll illustrate some of that a little bit later. But I've now been on an effort to actually start exploring the landscape beyond 802.11, beyond what is already out there, or beyond wireless war driving, to actually take things from a slightly wider viewpoint. And so things I'm looking at here is, okay, we've got what we've referred to as the urban littoral, or what I've referred to as the urban littoral. How does this environment look like, and what can we deduct from it? So over the years, I've been doing trial and error with a bunch of hardware and technology, such as software-defined radios. Incredibly versatile, sometimes may not draw everything, sometimes may not be the best use of tech. So, for example, when we've done some of our 802.15.4 work, we've actually found that the Texas Instruments CC2531 USB has actually been more effective. Same with ESP32s as well for certain Bluetooth activities. That's been quite powerful, just because some of the other Bluetooth hardware we've had just hasn't probably played out as well as I would have liked to. I mean, if you want to start simple, usually a single USB device, such as the USB adapters you can pick out of office work, are actually a good start. What I have had to do over the years, however, as I said, if you think about this from a line of sight, but also from having single devices to actually do our collection, if I've only got the one USB, I could only listen in on one channel at any one point in time. And I mentioned before, if you have a look at the 2.4, if you have a look at 802.15.4 from channels, I believe it's from 11 up to 25, that part of the frequency range, you need about 16 USB devices to collect over that entire network reliably. And so, yeah, I've just simply built a sizable bank in order to achieve that. GPS, of course, is the other one that helps us out to identify a point in time. However, if you're just in a fixed location doing collection on a single channel at that point for an extended period, well, doing the wider enumeration isn't too much of a problem. Also, power sources, these do take up a little bit of energy, especially if you're in your car. So things like tons of battery banks, USB battery banks, have been quite helpful for this activity. In terms of some of the software I've been using, once again, this has been trial and error. This is either trying to take some of the existing code that's been provided by manufacturers, which is okay, or trying to build our own scripts in order to achieve the same effect. Kismet I've found has just been reliable, and there's now a lot more plugins there, but there's also limitations to some of that as well. So, I've been doing war driving in 802.11ah, which is sub-gigahertz Wi-Fi. There isn't anything there for Kismet for that. So I've actually had to go out and build some of my own tooling to achieve that. So I think, now as I'm starting to, still use Kismet quite reliably, I'll probably start working some of the bits and pieces around that. I'll show you shortly the analytics environment I've had to build. So a limitation that you actually have within Kismet is that it's kind of hard to read the data effectively. I've also tried to do user interface design. However, I am a pen tester, not a UX person, so it's been a learning lesson there as well. So over time, I've been building out, and this is off at the back of a couple of years. Whenever I've had some spare time, just go out, do a war drive, do a play with a protocol I've discovered. So if you have a look on the left-hand, your left-hand side, discovery of the actual cell tower network in Sydney was a project I did during COVID, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then in the centre there, building out a very simple bit of code for war driving in 802.15.4, which then led to the bigger war drive system, which led to the mapping that you can see on the far side there. Then things like trunked radio networks in Sydney, mapping those out, which is the image in the centre with the black. That was just simply a pie that we built out to do capture on a single frequency, all the way down to war driving LoRa with some hardware that I picked out of, I think it was Norway we got those USB dongles out of, just to actually work out what was out there. So what has happened over time? As I said, my biggest struggle has actually been, okay, how do I collect tons of data and then present it in a way that's actually readable? I have been trying to play with Elasticsearch, and I only just started to get this into a workable state quite recently. But what I've been able to do is just take data out of Kismet and a couple of other tools, start punching it into Elasticsearch. There's a couple of, there was a publication that was done out of a couple of guys in the US on this, using the latest version of Elasticsearch. I've kind of been using the older versions because it's what I'm familiar with. But what has happened with the data that we've collected there? So this was over a couple of days earlier this year. We would have found about 100,000 devices just within that central area of the CBD alone. And look, a lot of it is your stock standard 802.11 networks, which most people are actually doing quite well in this space. They're using WPA2. We probably can't verify the password because that might be a little bit questionable, where we've seen a reduction in open and web networks. But from a pen testing experience, I think one thing my team and I have always found is that we've been getting better over the last couple of years. But then there's all these other weird and wonderful spaces that I don't think we've discovered or fully understood. So Bluetooth was an interesting one that we kept coming across. So lots of Bluetooth locks, and have they actually factored into the security of the organisation or the environment as a whole? We keep seeing building control systems, so 802.15.4 sensors. There was some security systems that we saw beating out between 433, 435 megahertz, which were quite interesting. If you have a look, using the same system that we ran in 2018 to today, we're seeing a lot more 802.15.4 networks, and this is things such as home automation systems. We also see blinds, locks in hotels. So there is one hotel in Pitt Street in Sydney. We've just gone for a full 802.15.4 implementation of their locks. I don't think our security knowledge in that domain has evolved recently, but for me, it's now turned into another area for me to start diving into. But the other peculiar one has been listening in on licensed radio communications, which we are allowed to do. So things like public transport systems communicating in data and voice and clear text. I think what's curious here isn't so much that those systems are performing those actions, but more so that we are now starting to see increased capability of threat actors. So the ubiquity and availability of software-defined radio has meant that, well, a kid, a 15-year-old kid can just buy some kit out off AliExpress and start using that willy-nilly. And then, of course, the other one I showed there before was a screenshot of our war drive of what are the cell towers that are actually operating in Sydney. And I guess there were two things that we did see. One was security misconfigurations in some of those systems, all the way through to rogue systems that someone just decided to spin up because they needed their own cell tower. Who knows why? But then there's just, okay, well, what's beyond here? What's in this data set that we've collected that, if we just do a bit of a deep dive, there's things that are a little concerning. So we even saw in some of the Bluetooth systems, MAC addresses that were associated with manufacturers that really didn't have a commercial manufacturing of Bluetooth that we knew of. So it's like, oh, this, is this interesting? Like if you've got a system from, if your MAC address is associated with defense industry, that's kind of a little bit curious. And what is this doing, beaconing out like this? But I think it's interesting to look at how events over the last couple of years, as well as even fiction, has started to probably shape some of my own thinking in terms of how these environments are going to play out. Awesome book that was published about Australia's efforts in Mosul. What was curious was there was an electronic warfare operator that was on the ground there, whose work in some of the communication systems with the drones led to the identification of the we'll call it the ISIS Air Force Base that was then subsequently disincentivized, which led to a 95% reduction in the operation of drones in that space. But things like, as I said, Killcullen's Out of the Mountains book, would highly recommend reading that in terms of understanding how does a threat actor play out in our urban environments, and how do they use technology to their advantage, but also how do we become disadvantaged. I think one curious one Killcullen highlights is probably more the social sphere of a loss of communications or incorrect messaging coming out in the Mumbai attacks actually probably caused more harm than the actual terrorists themselves. And also Birmingham, if you've ever read his book on this, well, we'll call it Sydney rental issues from the 90s, I forget what it was called, but he's actually done a really cool series recently where he actually explores in detail of, okay, here is how a set of systems failing in the US will actually lead to critical failure of our infrastructure. And then we look at, so I said, probably more the social aspects of how can we create undue influence in some of these technologies and some of these environments. So let's come back to that frame. As I said, as I illustrated up front, when we talk about cybersecurity, we need to be focusing on this interaction between the digital, physical, and social space. And I think more often than not, we tend to actually do a top-down approach. When we start exploring these environments, we jump to conclusions as to what can be hacked and what can't be. And I think taking some of these more data-driven approaches of, hey, here is this awesome data set that we've been able to collect and analyse, and build up from there to identify our interdependencies and understand how these systems actually interact from a total systems approach, I think is been quite fascinating, just going through those data sets I've been collecting. But then understanding off the back of that, not only the technical vulnerabilities of these systems, but how are they getting powered? How's their environment operating? Are there weather conditions that we need to be conscious of? How are they supported by other systems? Are there fundamental flaws in the technology or the management of some of these OT technologies? And then what's the underlying governance and support systems behind this? Then, okay, well, let's say for example, if a system operating on Bluetooth for door locks failed, how does that start playing out? And then factoring in the degradation or manipulation of any of these communication systems, what's the marked outcome, and do we have that resilience and that redundancy to help us deal with these problems, both from a technical and non-technical space? So all these things start to play out when we start doing these deep dives in these data sets that we've been collecting. Now, for those of you that are starting to get a little bit interested in going away and doing some more of your own research on this, I mean, I've still got tons of hardware sitting at home where I just like to pull it out and go for a bit of a war drive. Bunch of really cool resources for those of you that are interested in this space. As well as just some of the, I'm hoping to get the Elasticsearch instance I've put together out and freely available. If you do want a copy of it, just let me know and I'll freely hand it over. But other things as well, there are other resources as well on line of sight and antenna theory to factor in. I have not listed them here, but I'm happy to share those as well. I'll let Gary take a photo. But folks, this is just some cool stuff I've been diving into. Hopefully it's given you a little bit of a drive and a few things to think about in some of our physical environments. Thanks for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ed. That was fascinating. When you were profiling, did you profile, I noticed you said WEP's declining, or hopefully almost gone.
Yep.
Did you profile how many people are doing WPA3?
So I did actually have a bit of a search on that this morning when I spun up the VM. It's still, I'd probably guesstimate, it's probably only about 3 to 5%. And we saw this with, more broadly, 802.11ac. It takes about 3 to 5 years to propagate because, well, the hardware needs to exist to begin with. So, but, I guess it also comes back to people probably aren't changing over that quickly. So, but yeah, it's still quite small.
Any other questions? All right, I've got one. 802.15.4, so that falls under like your Zigbees, all that sort of fun stuff.
Yep.
Is there any open source tooling that exists for that, or?
Yes, there is actually a fair bit. I mean, the one that's fairly known is the Killcullen framework, but some of the hardware for that's a little bit hard to get. There's another one where I do have the hardware that connects to a Raspberry Pi. It's built in Python. I'm just trying to remember what it is. I'm pretty sure I've got it somewhere in my reading list. Do hit me up and I'll pass it on to you.
Sounds good. Yep, question.
Thanks, Ed. Would you mind showing us the QR code again, please?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. I should have put the QR code at the end as well. So for those of you who have joined late, I provide a QR code for all my talks so that you don't need to keep photographing slides. And yes, you can trust the QR code.
Any more questions from the audience? I'll stick on the Zigbee train. So the specialist hardware, I set up my own home assistant setup, got a little Zigbee controller that you have to flash to get it to work with Philips Hue. Absolute pain in the ass. Is it similar when you're trying to actually attack these devices?
To an extent. So, I mean, a lot of the code out there is, so for example, the Killcullen framework that we've used on some of our tests, it's either working or it's not working. So I think we have had some of those similar experiences, probably not so much with flashing as much as with just, either it works or it doesn't work. In fact, we had that with a power management system we were testing for I think it was there to control air conditioning, where it's just like, actually setting up the hardware for us to test, like the trial hardware, was the bigger challenge. And then when we started testing, it's like, there's really not too much here that we can do. funnily enough, like the big one that we've actually seen with 802.15.4 is just it's easy to jam. By the way, jamming, bad idea. Do it in a Faraday cage. So, but yeah, like jamming for it, we really didn't need much power to actually do any jamming. So, you know, if you've got an OT network with high availability that's performing a control function, you know, have you factored that into your threat model?
So could you potentially set up one of these jammers as a war drive, just walk around and see what starts failing?
Hypothetically, I mean, the one that's always interested me, right, is, so if I come back down here, kids, don't do this at home. Sorry, don't use the laser at home. So noting this is a solar power farm, for example, what if you just took a couple of cheap ESP32s that are non-identifiable, just had them, you know, bursting out on the allocated frequency, drop them over, you know, throw them over the fence and leave them for the next 12, 24 hours with a battery pack on them? You know, what's the impact of that as a threat? Because, hey, we can walk right up to the fence. You know, does that start playing out? And then what's the second and third order effects of that? So you heard me talk before about, well, this is a power plant. You know, 5 to 10% of power is now coming through renewable energy. Do we now lose trust in solar power, noting that energy is traded in this country? From a supply and demand standpoint, do we increase the price that we then resell? I hope I'm not giving anyone any ideas here, but you're about to say go on.
I was just going to say we could collaborate on an anarchist cookbook for wireless technologies.
To anyone from law enforcement listening, I do not know this man.
Looks like we got another question in the back.
No question, just making I don't think I caught like the original, your thesis or why you were collecting this in the first place. Do you just want to democratize this data and make it available for people?
I want to make the analysis a little bit more available. I think if you have a look right now, I think the problem is, I think a lot of our analysis is, everyone that's kind of working in this space kind of gets wiggle. Yeah, cool, you can find things on MapRad, but I think there's a lot more opportunity to do decent analysis, and I don't think we've had some of the, I think probably the big one has been discovery, and trying to work out, all right, if we're doing pen testing, we're saying we're doing wireless pen testing, simply rocking up with a pineapple is wholly ineffective. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we've illustrated with the data that we have collected as well. All right, are you looking at the, are you looking at all the other wireless technologies that exist in our, well, at a corporate level in our office environment, but at the level of an urban environment? How do all of these start playing out? And to our point before, can this lead to an impact from a critical infrastructure standpoint? So that's kind of where my exploration's been diving through.
Thanks. Yeah, just jumping back to some of the discussion around jamming and that sort of thing. Do you think that there's much risk associated with some of this war driving? Do you try to focus on more passive listening rather than any
yeah, so this is
OT networks, that sort of thing? So
this is all passive discovery. I mean, some of the Bluetooth stuff we'll probe for, but yeah, otherwise, and like if you have a look at where is it? So if you have a look at the 802.15.4, these are 16 antennas that are just listening. Yep.
Please put it together for Ed. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
I'll be up the back if you on the outside if you want to have any more questions.